So the Four Foundations of Mindfulness. The article that I referred to in the email presents a much more extensive presentation than the Four Foundations of Mindfulness that is in the Truth to Happiness book. And the main reason for that is that the Truth to Happiness book was written as a course of study. And the longer sutta that we went through, and there was, I think, 6 or 7 talks on over the summer, presented the whole the Satipatthana Sutta, the Sutta on the Four Foundations of Mindfulness, in which the Buddha teaches the proper application of mindfulness. The Buddha's words: friends, this is the only way for the purification of beings, for the overcoming of sorrow and regret, for the destruction of suffering and grief, for reaching the right path, for the attainment of nibbana, for the attainment of awakening, namely the Four Foundations of Mindfulness. So the Buddha is describing the importance of mindfulness in developing awakening, developing full human maturity, but also he's speaking in this sutta a very specific type of mindfulness. So mindfulness means to recollect or to hold in mind, and we can do that with anything. We can hold in mind unskillful or even destructive things. A good example of that is a compulsive idea that drives you to behavior that is hurtful towards yourself or others. Addiction is a good example of that. But there's all types of examples of compulsive behavior that are hurtful. A mind that's rooted in ignorance is a mind that is compulsive towards continuing to establish its own ignorance. Is that clear, or at least understandable to everyone, that last statement? Another way of saying that is just a deluded mind will continue its own delusion unless there's something developed to show it its deluded thinking and present an alternative to that thinking. The Buddha awakened to dependent origination, which states from ignorance through 12 observable causative links, all manner of suffering arises. The initial condition in dependent origination is that ignorance gives rise to mental fabrications. Another way of saying that is mental fabrications, a requirement for mental fabrications is an ignorance. And this is a very specific type of ignorance. It's ignorance of Four Noble Truths. That points directly to the problem of the general unsatisfactoriness of life and a lack of understanding of who we are in relation to the world around us is a thinking problem. Meaning it's a thinking problem more than an environmental problem. We are distracted, disappointed, we suffer, not only because of the physical conditions of the world we live in, but because of the way we think about ourselves in relation to those physical conditions. So when the Buddha describes suffering, he described it this way consistently through 45 years of his teaching career. Birth is suffering. Sickness is suffering. Aging is suffering. Death is suffering. Not getting what is desired is suffering. Receiving what is undesired is suffering. And sometimes there'd be a few other modifiers in there. And then he would conclude that statement by saying, in short, the 5 clinging aggregates are suffering. The 5 clinging aggregates we know describe the personal experience of suffering. It's the whole package of physical form, feelings, perceptions, mental fabrications, and ongoing consciousness, the 5 clinging aggregates, that present the experience of suffering, and that we experience the disappointment inherent in life that is marked by the 3 marks of existence: impermanence, and not self-characteristic, and the resulting dukkha. So it's a thinking problem that is the ongoing cause of dukkha. Being a thinking problem, the solution has to be a way of recognizing and abandoning thought patterns. Maybe I should add, doesn't it? So the Buddha presented a way. Let me go back just a little bit. Upon his awakening, the Buddha realized that the common human problem of ignorance of Four Noble Truths leads to a constantly distracted mind. The reason for that is that this thing called anatta, the not self-characteristic, insists on establishing itself in every thought, word, and idea that occurs. In other words, every thought, word, idea needs to be a self-referential thought to a misunderstanding of self that insists on continuing to establish itself. Another way of just saying ignorance. So this mind rooted in ignorance creates very subtle and very powerful strategies to continue to ignore its own ignorance. And that can generally be called the world. In the Loka Sutta, the Buddha describes himself looking out on the world just post his awakening. And he describes it like this: the world is a flame. From his awakened point of view, and in a very succinct way, he recognized that the problem of thinking rooted in ignorance resulted in a world that is aflamed with passion. Kevin mentioned this just a little earlier. With a passion for self-referential sustainment. I need to see myself in everything that occurs. I need the world to satisfy me. And if it doesn't, I don't like it. It's the essence of an immature mind, isn't it? Baby doesn't get what it wants, it screams and hollers. We do the same thing with our reaction from not getting what we want or not getting enough of what we think we need to be happy. That is dukkha. The second noble truth says craving originates and clinging perpetuates that suffering, that general unsatisfactory nature of life. So in the Satipatthana Sutta, and we went through the Anapanasati Sutta, very similar, the Buddha begins with teaching how to begin to develop a well-concentrated mind in meditation. And he begins that by saying, we first become mindful of the breath in the body, which is exactly what we do, isn't it? That's how we begin our meditation. And then he taught that a human being has feelings and a human being has thoughts, usually attached to those feelings. Sometimes it's thoughts that seem to give rise to feelings. We might have a memory of something that happened yesterday, and I feel angry over it. Feelings and thoughts are part of being a human being. The Buddha never denied that we should be human beings. In fact, his teaching allows us to be human beings without the need for our humanness to be any different than it is. He taught radical acceptance. Go back to that first description of dukkha. Birth is suffering, birth is dukkha, sickness, aging, death. It's all, we can't escape that if we're going to have a human life. Why did the Buddha think that that was the most important thing to put out there in front of everything else he ever taught? To simply point out that as a consequence of human life, there's going to be disappointment. We can't escape it. What should we do when we can't escape anything? What's a mature way of handling things that we can no longer escape, that are simply what's occurring? We accept it. It does not mean that we have to approve of it, but we accept it simply because it's what's occurring. That's a change in thinking, isn't it? From thinking that I need to approve and I need to chase after things that I find acceptable rather than accepting things as they occur. And that last part is the definition of an awakened human being, accepting things as they occur. But also understanding that's only possible when we have a profound understanding of impermanence, meaning that if in this moment I'm experiencing something that is less than ideal, because I understand impermanence, I don't have to react to it, because I know all I have to do is take a breath and it's going to change, or eventually it will change. We cannot establish anything fixed in the world. That's the big change in thinking. So in the rest of the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha then addresses, I left out the fourth foundation of mindfulness. The Buddha then teaches that to be mindful of feelings arising and passing away during meditation, thoughts arising and passing away, and come back to the sensation of breathing. That's the new instructions reflect that. And if we can do that, if we can stay present with our feelings arising and passing away and our thoughts arising and passing away without the need for that initial or immediate experience to be any different, then our minds remain calm and at peace, which is what everybody wants. We want to find a way to have a mind that is always calm, always peaceful, and that we're always in control of. In the Vitakka-Santana Sutta, the Buddha states that we gain the ability to think what we want to think when we want to think it. That means that our thoughts in relation to what's occurring in our life are always skillful and appropriate and always framed by the Eightfold Path. We've gone from a reactive and diluted way of looking at the world to a way that our thinking is well framed by the reality of living in this permanent world. That's often described as a mind that is spacious, a mind that is peaceful, a mind that is non-confrontational, a non-competitive mind, non-aggressive mind. That mind is thinking differently than it was prior to that new way of thinking, isn't it? So the Buddha taught mindfulness to first recognize thinking that leads to ongoing dukkha so that we can abandon it and develop through the framework of the Eightfold Path a way of thinking that remains calm and peaceful no matter what's occurring. And so that mind thinks what it wants to think when it wants to think, whatever is appropriate, and abandons or practice restraint on things that are inappropriate to think and that lead to distress, that lead to dukkha. Is that clear? So the entire Buddha Dhamma is about changing the way that we think and restricting our thinking to only what is skillful. And people don't like the idea or that word restricting. But restraint is the essence of the Dhamma. Knowing where we're engaging in eye-making, recognizing that, and abandoning it. And we eye-make in our thinking, don't we? That's clear. In our minds, in this act of ongoing eye-making or ongoing conceit, is itself rooted in mental fabrications. That initial condition arising from ignorance. So as we develop the ability to think what we want to think when we want to think it, then we can address our thinking. Maybe I should use the word direct. We can then direct our thinking to awakening and away from ignorance. So in this sutta, the Buddha then teaches, after the Four Foundations of Mindfulness, meaning how to meditate, he then teaches to use that concentration, that well-concentrated mind, now developing the broader framework of the Eightfold Path, to recognize hindrances. Very practical teachings, doesn't it? Recognize that from this well-concentrated mind, we now have the ability to recognize things that commonly arise in human beings, but not react to them in a way that would block our development of the Dhamma. So we recognize when doubt arises. And because our minds are now well concentrated and our thinking is changing, we don't just give in to doubt. We don't just give in to skepticism. When we're tired and we just don't feel like sitting or spending a few minutes reading about the Dhamma or coming to a class on a cold Saturday morning, we don't give in to it. Our minds are well concentrated enough to say, no, that's a hindrance. This is something for my benefit. I want to continue to do with it. I'm not going to go through all the hindrances. The Buddha then, in the Satipatthana Sutta, mentions to be mindful of the 5 clinging aggregates so as, and his teachings are, so as to not create clinging through a misunderstanding of what constitutes a self. Very practical teaching. But we need a measure of concentration and the proper framework to recognize that, don't we? To understand 5 clinging aggregates. Then he talks about being mindful of the 6th sense base and to practice restraint when clinging arises. So just think about that for the practicality of that teaching. He's describing what it's like to be a human being with physical senses and that 6th sense of thinking. In this sense, thinking rooted in ignorance of 4 noble truths. And to use that as the way of recognizing and abandoning anything rooted in ignorance or any behavior rooted in that ignorance in the moment as life occurs. I hope so. And it won't be the same way I just said it. The Buddha teaches to practice restraint in our life as life occurs when I'm making is arising. When I'm reacting to something in the present moment, in my life, as my life occurs, in a way that is rooted in ignorance, and so it's furthering the establishment of a self in this moment. I always use the chocolate cake thing. So I have a nice taste of chocolate cake. And because my mind is so distracted and I'm so full of desire, satisfying this ego self, when I eat one piece of chocolate cake, I usually eat the whole cake. I've lost the ability to practice restraint in that moment at the first bite. As my concentration increases and my view of myself in relation to the world is taking a more realistic view because it's framed by the Eightfold Path, I recognize that one bite or maybe one slice is enough. And for all a mature mind will then practice restraint at that point, and will be able to walk away from the chocolate cake. Now, I'm using chocolate cake for metaphor for everything that gets our attention and we're engaged in eye-making. It might be an argument that we feel we need to prove that we're right. It might be in a day that's just not flowing the way we hope to. It may be in our spouse, our partner who's not acting the way we want. It might be our new dog that's not. It could be anything that we become attached to and decide that we need this situation to be different in order for me to be happy right now, rather than radical acceptance of what's occurring because it's what's occurring. So did I answer that?
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's just that I kind of tuned out for a second, so I missed that. So
yes. So the Buddha points out in the Satipatthana Sutta, the sixth sense base, so we are mindful of practicing restraint at the sixth sense base. So again, do you see how the Satipatthana Sutta is now instruction for how to apply mindfulness? Rooted in concentration. The Buddha first teaches us how to deepen concentration in meditation, the Four Foundations of Mindfulness. Then we can take that mindfulness and apply it in very specific ways. In other words, to think in very specific ways. Further on in the sutta, the Buddha talks about now using that increasingly well-concentrated mind, developing the framework of the Eightfold Path, to use that refined mindfulness to hold in mind the 7 factors of awakening, meaning to think about them. Again, we're introducing a different way of thinking and a different way of looking at the world. Maybe I should say that we're introducing a different way of thinking so to have the effect of a different view of the world. Because how we think about ourselves in relation to the world will determine how we experience our life. And if we base that thinking on reality, meaning an understanding of the Four Noble Truths, it changes the entire experience of our life. Then our life is no longer filled with craving and clinging, which results in dukkha, the second noble truth. And our thoughts, words, and deeds are anchored or founded in these 4 foundations of mindfulness that supports the refined mindfulness of the Eightfold Path. So the Buddha concludes the Satipatthana Sutta by saying to be mindful of the Four Noble Truths, and in particular to hold in mind the Eightfold Path. So the 4 foundations of mindfulness first establish how we deepen concentration in meditation, and then points to the importance of changing the way we think, founded on that new concentration, by developing the refined mindfulness of the Eightfold Path. The Anapanasati Sutta covers the same basic subject matter in a slightly different way, where the Buddha is describing how to respond to what's occurring during meditation. I won't get into that. We went through a 6-week course on that too. But that's reflected in the new instructions on the guided meditation instruction. Excuse me. So that's the talk on the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Are you leaving, Kevin?
Yes.
Good to see you this morning. What I'd like to hear is how you're using those 4 foundations in your meditation to deepen concentration, if you are, and how you see that concentration supporting the mindfulness of the refined mindfulness to hold in mind the Eightfold Path. So start with Kevin. Kevin, good to see you this morning.
Good to see you. Well, this sutta, or this chapter,
Take care, Joe. Good to see you.
really hits on so many things. Within the meditation practice, when you develop this concentration, this mindfulness, you're able to see the process at a slower pace, the arising of feelings, which I think it might be important to put the physical thing around the feelings, as we've talked about with Matt here before. The feelings tend to sometimes involve the physical sensations in the body, and the thoughts are the mental. So there's sort of a relationship there. You're able to see that when you're practicing holding in mind the 4 foundations of mindfulness during your meditation. I think that given that and sort of that experience in meditation also allows you off the cushion to experience these same types of processes, the
Yes.
feelings arising, the thoughts attached to the feelings, which then become emotions. And we all know where that's going to go to stress and unsatisfactoriness, more so. Specifically in life and in my life, there's been a situation lately that's probably been perhaps the most trying situation I've had to deal with undertaking this practice for years ago. And it involves something that immediately starts this process at a faster pace. And it involves a personal financial consolidation project that I'm working on. And be able to see how quickly and almost naturally feelings and thoughts arise concerning something that's so impermanent as such as money. And when things aren't happening the way you want them to, or at the pace that you want them to, it took the most amount of restraint I think I've had to probably practice in a long, long time, because I've been frankly treated with injustice by a large organization, a corporation, a financial institution that's treated me. I've had some real dissatisfaction with the way they've handled this. And it took me a lot of restraint on the telephone numerous times to practice the Eightfold Path. And right there was right speech. And I had the choice to either, practice right speech and say what I needed to say and be direct to get this task completed. Whereas I think formerly I would have just, taken my chance to just tee off on somebody and yell at them. And I said what I needed to say, and it was forthright, direct, no profanity, no raising the voice, and they were direct words. And it resulted in completing this task, which I look back and wow, by holding that restraint in mind and being calm, but being direct and accepting the way things have been, which has been very unsatisfactory for me, I was able to get it done. And even Matt and I've talked about it, and he was like, wow, why didn't you just go let him have it? And I said, really, friend, brother, what would that have done? What is that going to do besides personalize the situation and affect me and get me worked up? It was working with what I had, and it was able to work. So just not to get, I just really think this sutta brought that all back for me, because in those moments I was speaking directly, expressing my dissatisfaction, but also returning to my breath, also returning to the arising of feelings, and to see where that could have gone 4 or 5 years ago or something. If I would have just teed off, I would have felt a feeling here of tightness in probably my chest that would have worked through here, through my body, probably bounced back up into my head and really stressed me out to the point where, wow, where did this even come from? So by having such a fast thing and sped up things such as money involved, and then the Dhamma over here and the meditation practice really was an incredible source of understanding and wisdom for me in one sort of task or project. So I don't know if that made any sense.
That made a lot of sense. Thank you.
I got what I needed to get done. Merrill Lynch is, don't ever do business with them again. I hope if you are, be careful, because I used to work for them and they've done what they needed to do, but they've treated someone very unfortunately here. So
what a perfect example of how to apply the Dhamma. That's exactly it. The stress that was inherent in the situation wasn't exacerbated because you maintained a calm and peaceful presence, and that the whole difficulty with situations like that, it's nearly impossible to live in the world and not connect our identity to money and our possessions, and not develop a wrong view, but a view of self based on that. So when something affects that in a direct way, it's really hard not to react, because it feels like a direct attack and directed at me, at this 5 clinging aggregate thing. But when looked at in reality, the way you did, the actions of one particular company are described in the First Noble Truth. dukkha occurs. It's just part of living in the world. It's not to be taken personally. And the way to deal with it is not to ignore it, but to address it from a realistic point of view, to speak directly, to speak honestly, calmly, peacefully, but to state your position. There's so many people get the idea that to become a Buddha, as the Buddha taught, means that we should just let anything and everything happen to ourselves. And that's not true. We state who we are, we state our presence, and we accept what occurs. But we understand that the nature of the world is dukkha, and that we don't take it personally. We're able to maintain a calm and peaceful mind like you did. So, thank you for saying that. It made great sense. Laura, good to see you this morning.
I don't remember what your question was, but
How's your Dhamma practice going? How's the Four Foundations working in your Dhamma practice?
the Four Noble Truths.
The Four Foundations of Mindfulness. Form, feeling, perception. No, I mean, breath in your body, feelings arising, thoughts arising, and the present quality of your mind. But anything you want to talk about.
Well, since I didn't even know what they were at this moment, I feel like I'm not, in all honesty, I'm not in a very concentrated place right now, but I am trying to stay present and remembering that all is impermanent. So I think the last time I was here, I left and it was like this really wonderful day. It was a really just wonderful meditation and very clear. We ended up getting this wonderful dog just after that. So, and then life got really busy. And so here I am, like completely scatterbrained and not feeling very well. So I have been trying to meditate so terribly inconsistently, like the time of day is never the same time, and but I have been doing longer chunks, which is really strange because in the past it's always been like 10 minutes in the morning and 10 minutes at night, and if I couldn't do the nighttime, it was always in the morning. If I couldn't do the morning, it was always at night, but it was just 10 minutes, and so for some reason I decided to like push myself to do, a 25-minute sit.
Oh, good.
Anyway, so everything feels a little bit all over the place. And so am I remembering these things and not so much? I feel like I'm kind of stuck with the Four Noble Truths as my backbone. But this is my life right now, I suppose. So thank you. Thank you, Sangha, for being here, and John, for staying true to these teachings and keeping them simple.
Thank you. I'm glad you're here. The important thing to remember about the mindfulness, as the Buddha teaches mindfulness, as we develop the ability to hold in mind the principles of awakening, and that's what you're doing. Yeah. I mean, and the more you're able to engage in this, the more you do it, and you have your understanding
It
of.
seems like I get to this point where things are, I'm having these good clear meditations and very clear, and like I feel like I'm able to take more on or something, or and I started working 5 days a week, and I'm able to be in these more complicated relationships in my life, and I think that is due to the fact that I've had a practice and I've been reading and studying for the past I don't know how many years it's been, but because otherwise I don't think I'd be capable of taking that on.
Yeah.
So it seems like there's a little bit of a like, oh, you got to Chicago, but now you're going to go back to New York, and you're never going to make it to California. But it feels a little bit like that right now. But yes, glad to be here.
I'm glad you're here too. Dhamma practice is just like that. Sometimes it just comes easy, and sometimes we have to put in effort. That's why the sixth factor, the Eightfold Path, right effort, is there to remind us. And also the Buddha taught the Eightfold Path as a middle way, meaning that it allows us to be a human being while we find a balance between the busyness of life and Dhamma practice, that middle way. And you're doing it, establishing it as best you can, but you're also learning like everyone else does. The more we engage in the right effort, the more we get out of the Dhamma. It's just the way it is. Great to hear this morning. Becky, good to see you this morning.
Good to be here. The Four Foundations of Mindfulness is, I feel it more than I feel the Eightfold Path. I feel like I'm to the point where I've had a good week. I got back into my medication schedule. So I was able to meditate every morning for at least 10, sometimes 15 minutes, which I felt good about. And reading about the Four Foundations of Mindfulness as I was doing that informed my meditation in sort of, if I can say, an emotional way or a feeling kind of way. Whereas if I just thought about my breath rising and passing away, kept my thoughts in the background, that was all I was able to concentrate on. And when my thoughts came, go back to my breathing, then what would happen in my meditation is by the time I was at the end, I would realize that my mind was just really calm, that I wasn't going with my thoughts as much as I was at the beginning. I wasn't getting caught up in my thoughts as much. And I felt like, like I was getting it. You can put it that way. But when that was over, as the day goes on, I don't feel like I'm really keeping in mind the Eightfold Path. I still feel like I just go back to reacting to things the way I've always reacted. Maybe I don't. Maybe that's just me thinking that. But then because by the end of the week, when it's time to come here again, I even though I've done my meditation, I still feel just scattered and I have this little tightness in my head, and then when I come here, it sort of all melts away. And then I think, well, maybe I'll do better the next week at home, and I won't keep regressing. Not regressing, but or maybe I'm expecting too much. I don't know. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. It's the nature of anatta.
I feel really good about it, though. Let me just say that.
Well, good. You feel good about.
I do.
It's the nature of anatta to never be satisfied.
Right.
And so when we are reflecting that back on ourselves, no matter how much effort we put in, we'll never be satisfied when it's from that point of view. But you're recognizing the benefits of Dhamma practice. You're recognizing directly a calm and peaceful mind as a direct result from meditation. That's the foundation. And off of that foundation, we're able to then integrate the broader framework of the Eightfold Path. So and that's exactly how this course is designed too. In the coming weeks, next week is the Four Noble Truths, and we get into how to actually integrate the Eightfold Path. So it's not, we usually learn, or the learning model is that we read something, we memorize it, and now we know it. The Dhamma is a different learning model. We read about something usually, or we listen to a talk, and then we experience it, and then we know it. The Dhamma can't be known until it's experienced. But learning about American history can be known without the experience of American history. All you have to do is read the books and have a good memory. This is different. And so it's an ongoing process that is rooted in just what we're doing here as a Sangha. those that have been on retreat have heard me say this a few times. In a very real way, what we're experiencing here in this little room in Frenchtown, New Jersey, is just what the first Sangha experienced 2,600 years ago, meaning the direct teachings of the Buddha and nothing else. And that opens the opportunity to do what people did 2,600 years ago too, is awaken. But it's an ongoing process. The Buddha didn't just give one teaching or publish one book and say, this is it, you're good to go. It was an ongoing experiential development of the Dhamma that allowed many people to awaken. And that's just exactly what we're doing. So, and what we're all describing is a process of integrating the Eightfold Path as it's intended. There's nowhere that I've ever read, I've read a lot of the Pali Canon, not the entire Pali Canon, but a lot of it. There's nowhere where the Buddha says it's going to take you 3.5 weeks to awaken. And if it's longer than that, forget it. You're no good. It's an ongoing process. Some people, the Buddha's very first teaching, Khandana awakened. Over 45 years later, Ananda awakened, who listened to every teaching the Buddha ever gave and did not awaken until a month after the Buddha passed. The time isn't important. The important thing to remember and to put our focus on is that sixth factor of the Eightfold Path. The most important thing we can do in our life is to awaken, isn't it? It simply makes our lives and the people we interact with much more pleasant, much more mindful. And you're describing that beautifully. And the other thing is that, you know, by the week later and you're ready to get back to the Sangha, that's the way it should be too. The Buddha pointed out the importance of the Sangha and supporting each other in awakening, to be a part of this. So, thank you. Glad you're here. Jen, good to see you this morning.
Good to see you. Thank you for reminding me that I already forget it.
Welcome to my mind.
So that reminds me of unsatisfied, being unsatisfactory, that anatta is never satisfied.
Never.
And
It's nature.
Forget that. And so I want to add to the comment that you just had. You learn it, you experience it, you know it, you forget it, you're reminded of it, you experience it again. Because I'm definitely, hearing that again, oh, right, so when I'm unsatisfied, that's a way of recognizing the anatta, kind of sussing it out in your own mind.
Yep, and that's the moment you practice restraint.
Right.
There's the I making.
Right.
I want this to be different.
Mm-hmm. And restraint was the other thing that I took away from today's talk. I've worked with and thought about and utilized restraint, but seeing that restraint is something you can practice with regard to your thinking.
Yes.
What to think about, or what to think about, is something that I understand. I don't always use restraint, but when I notice that I'm unsatisfied or that I'm tense in my thinking, that it helps me practice restraint. And that's really, it was nice to be reminded of that, and that is the benefits of this practice. Because, I feel like I really have struggled significantly with thinking for my whole life. I feel like even as a kid, it was always like, why are you thinking about that? Why are you worried about that? Why, coming up with catastrophizing scenarios in my mind of different things that can happen, and being just burdened by like fears constantly, and even as a young person, and having this capacity to like recognize that I was thinking about that thing and that it's not helping me, but having no method of practicing restraint, knowing what to practice restraint about, knowing what to not beat yourself up about, and it's just nice to have that.
It is. Thank
And
you.
the Four Foundations of Mindfulness really, it's like, that's how you get in, I feel like that's the entry point to being able to recognize, or it's sort of the moment you say to yourself, okay, I need to practice restraint. It's, okay, return your mindfulness to your breath, to your feelings, to your thoughts, and gain that objectivity.
Yes, that's great. Thank you. The Four Foundations of Mindfulness are also referred to sometimes as the four frames of reference, which means that when we're caught up in something, to use this to frame our reference to it. Whatever it is, I'm reacting to something, recognize it. It's simply a reaction. It's simply I making practice restraint. Come back to what's occurring in this moment. Mm-hmm. Because anything that when we're truly established in the moment, and I don't mean the present moment, that can become another kind of conditioned thought. I must be in the present moment, and there's no such thing as a present moment in practicality. What we can do is to use our mindfulness to be mindful of our life as it's unfolding, and simply to be present with it, and understanding the impermanence and the understand the continuity of impermanence. And the reason why I'm saying it that way is even though something seems to be persistent, it's still impermanent. And we can take a breath and relax. It's also when we're able to do that on our cushions, and Kevin was talking about this too, the training that we get on our cushions to practice restraint right now. Right now, I'm not going to get caught up in that thought. I'm going to practice restraint and come back to the sensation of breathing. That is training in restraint. I'm not going to indulge myself in my thoughts like I always do, which is that's fantasizing, isn't it? It's also imagination. It's also ignorance. Ignorance requires a very fertile imagination, including imagining something that might occur that will never occur. But we get caught. You were talking about catastrophizing. Yeah. That's an aspect that is rooted in ignorance. We do that because we don't understand the nature of the world. Something awful might happen. The bomb might hit us right here in the next moment. Let's wait and see what happens. No, it didn't happen. But it could. So why should we meditate? Because boom. But it might not too. So why don't we meditate? We can have a pleasant moment without worrying about the bomb. And it's good that we laugh about this, but I grew up in a time when you had to worry, literally worry every day. I remember walking home from school, probably second or third grade, when the air raid sirens went off. We were trained, when you heard those, to find shelter immediately, kind of like what happened in Hawaii a week ago. I grew up, not me, a lot of children grew up in that. Yeah, that's the world we grew up in. And it's hard not to think that, well, the next moment might be it, but you can't live like that. Because the next moment might be something else entirely. Inherent in all of that, in the infinite possibilities of what might occur in the next moment, is dukkha. Because if we're having a human life, the next moment is going to have an aspect of dukkha if we're craving for that moment to be different than it is, or clinging to the notion that it be different. No, clinging to something is clinging to an assumption, a fabrication, isn't it? Because whatever we're clinging to is impermanent. It hasn't happened and it will never happen. But we cling to the imagined or the expectation of something, and that's what it is. So it really is remarkable how we describe in somewhat different ways integrating the Dhamma in our life in a personal way. That's the beauty of a Sangha. Thank you. Diane, good to see you this morning. How are you?
Thank you for being here, and everybody for being here. I'm thankful to be here.
Um, okay. Feelings that come up. I have been really struggling with this, with sitting physically because of pain in my tush, and to focus on breathing has never been so difficult. All I can, my brain is just like echoing and vibrating, pain, 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 pain. And the thing that's funny, that's great about it is very slowly I'm beginning to breathe through it. I mean, just to focus on my breath and discard the pain. And the other night we were discussing this too, and I was thinking, I used a little metaphor of my mind is a garden, and what I'm learning to do is weed it. And I was thinking this morning while I was doing my morning exercises that if people have never had a garden and cultivated a garden, you know, that might not be a great metaphor, but it is for me, a vegetable garden or a flower garden. It's amazing. And then I wondered whether it was I making. Is that I making? I don't know, I would have to think about that, but it's just caring about my mind and what, you can't do what Kevin did if there's a bunch of weeds in your thinking. And I mean, I had a similar, not as grand an experience, but with a client. And it worked out because there were no weeds. And I think that's the beautiful part of metta coming through my life is, you know, the short version, may I be filled with loving kindness. May I mean, not the I making kind of thing, but anyway, well, it's like it's, what is it, the essence, the essential self, or something that is inside of us that you can see it as it having necessarily form or structure or anything like that, but there's something beautiful inside that, and these adjectives don't really touch it, but it's different than the weeds, I'll put it that way. Anyway,
Thank you. I think you want to mention that Thursday night too about cultivating it, and that's such a good way of looking, or a skillful way of looking at what we do with our minds. We can cultivate our minds towards awakening by putting in the right seeds, and that's the Eightfold Path. That's understanding the Four Noble Truths. It's reading about the other suttas that the Buddha taught. That's all cultivating our minds towards awakening. And that really is a good way of putting it. I wouldn't say that there's any essential inner nature, because that speaks to something that is permanent. It's best to see the who we are within the framework of the Dhamma as always impermanent. And which means when we develop a deeper understanding of the Dhamma, we understand that we're always in a process of becoming. And so then that allows us to hold in mind, what am I going to become in this moment, in this next moment? If I can practice restraint and use the framework of the Eightfold Path, then I can continue to become awakened. And it really has nothing to do with any inner nature or essential nature or Buddha nature or anything like that. Frankly, Buddha never taught any of that. He simply taught that to be mindful that we're in a process of becoming. If it even well, I don't want to get too deep into it, but the important thing is what's occurring right now. Laura, you had a question?
Yeah, would you say that there's like, you know, like the not self, and then like there's the not self, and then there's the not self.
The
Which if
The
you don't know
Buddha-
what that is, but
well, no, because that also implies a mystery where there does not need to be a mystery, where it's not useful to apply a mystery or meaning a mystical teaching to something. Again, the Buddha never taught that.
like to identify it in your thinking, like to identify anatta in your thinking.
Yes, so
like as the weeds or something.
the Buddha used the word anatta, which was a common word at his time, but in an uncommon way, much like he used the word karma. So let me just use it. I don't want to get too far into that. The Buddha used the word anatta to simply describe the fact that the views that we hold of a self are wrong views. They're views rooted in ignorance. They do not constitute a self. Let go of the views. But he didn't add a qualifier by saying your views of a self are wrong, but beneath those views is an essential nature or a Buddha nature. Because there wasn't. Implying that there's such a
that would just make another delusion.
Yeah, it's an anchor point for eye making, isn't it?
Yeah.
That okay, I accept the fact that whatever you might want to believe, but if I let go of all these things that are wrong about me, then I can find out what's right about me. Mm-hmm. What is more eye making than that? Because even the motivation then is, or the conclusion is already established, which is an ongoing view of a permanent self. The Buddha said there's no such thing. Not even in a derogatory way, just in a realistic way. He understood that everything is in a constant process of becoming, and the experience of that process is rooted in thinking, not in an essential nature. So the point isn't to uncover something. The point is to change the way you think and have it framed properly. And again, he gave us an eightfold path to frame that thinking. These are remarkably subtle teachings that we're discussing here. And I'm only saying that to emphasize it. There's nothing advanced in what the Buddha taught. In other words, there's no such thing as an advanced meditator or an advanced anything like that. But there is a difference between someone who is awakened and unawakened, or someone whose views are rooted in ignorance and those that aren't. And that's the point of this moment. What am I going to hold in mind? It's the point of the Four Foundations of Mindfulness. Learning to think what we want to think when we want to think it takes on a certain responsibility too. The responsibility is to learn what is appropriate to think about and to discard that which we find is not appropriate. So it's
that's really something.
It is, and that's the essence of it. To let go of these concepts. Again, I'm in no way putting this focus on you, Diane, because the great majority of modern Buddhists insist on an inner Buddha nature or an inner essential nature.
No, I think it's important that awakening, becoming. I mean, that addresses kind of what we're all talking about. It's not. We're not going to arrive at a destination that's everything will be easy and it will be all done and over and we'll be in heaven. We're going to keep going, even nirvana or whatever is, or heaven or whatever you want to call it, is we might have less weeds in our garden, but there's still things to cultivate and grow and keep going.
Yeah, we have to be careful about developing and then utilizing conceptual applications that will house the self, and the idea of an inner anything is one of those. The prevalent idea of a bodhisattva as a goal for awakening is rooted in that too, isn't it? And again, they're not.
It's scary.
I don't mean to put all those down and people to follow those ideas. It's unavoidable to do that when you point out the difference. But there's a significant difference, and the whole of the Dhamma comes down to this idea of eye making and how Am I going to continue to develop these subtle and powerful strategies to allow me to ignore my own ignorance? Or am I going to finally bite the bullet and say, wait a minute, all those notions, all those concepts that I held and at sometimes in my life put such great value on it that I would go to war. Now I'm talking about extreme examples of people that fight for their religious beliefs, go to war over, are just concepts. They're all rooted in ignorance. So in order for me, I can't probably ever happen. That's what's supposed to happen. We can't be of two minds. There's a saying. Ultimately, we're free to believe and act in any way and engage in any human beings. In this country, we have a whole bunch of rights that insist and ensure that we can do basically whatever we want as long as it's not hurting other people. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's how humans should live. We should be free to choose whatever we want and do whatever we want as long as we're not hurting other people. Maybe taking another step and hurt the environment. But we should be, that's how life should be. But just because that's how life should be doesn't mean that we as individuals should live our lives that way by insisting that we have infinite choices and we should be able to believe anything we want to believe. We can, but it's not helpful if we want to awaken. So as we develop the Eightfold Path, we start recognizing ideas and concepts that were only an establishment for a way to establish and continue to establish ignorance. We have to be willing to recognize those and abandon those. Of refined mindfulness, isn't it? Recognizing and abandoning those things that are continuous down a diluted path, and recognize and integrate the things that will deliver awakening.
Would you maybe agree or that this practice and this skillful context that we develop helps us see where views that are rooted in ignorance could be established in other practices, such as religious, spiritual, medical, whatever you want to. Those are for that, and this is for awakening. When you have that context, you'll see that those views can establish further views of anatta or not self.
Oh yeah,
rooted in ignorance, right?
Especially when you take things out of context, anything out of context. Systems that are useful in one context are usually not useful in other contexts. They're just different things. So when you look at it that way, there's no conflict or contradiction between what the Buddha taught and what everybody else taught then or since then. It's just different. But when you insist that things are the same, then you have to acknowledge, and if you're a responsible teacher, point out the contradictions, because then it just leads to confusion. And that's just the way it is. The Buddha taught exactly the same way. He didn't shy away from things, or he didn't point out things that were hindrances to developing the awakening. But he didn't put them down either. He just said, that's not it. It's not useful. It's not helpful. This is what you do. Debbie, good to see you this morning.
Oh, man, I'm confused now.
Uh-oh.
I'm gonna be really honest here.
Please.
Sometimes when I hear the talk about, well, this is the way the Buddha taught it, it reminds me so much of where I came from out of Catholicism.
Yep.
This is the way that Jesus taught it. It's only this way that Jesus taught it. And so the Catholics went to war over that, and had inquisitions and blah, 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 and you have to do it this way because this is the way Jesus taught it. So sometimes when I hear you talking about this is the way the Buddha taught it, this is the way, it feels rigid to me. It feels too familiar to other religions and how they're the way, the only way. And so that kind of alienates me when we have these discussions. Then I feel scared because I back away from rigidity. That doesn't feel beautiful.
Yep.
I don't know. I guess before I go on about other stuff, I just want to say that.
Can I hold you there
Yes,
then, please? And thank you for bringing up. It's important, and it's taken me quite a few years to just be comfortable in pointing out the differences, because I don't want to sound rigid. I don't want to sound evangelical in any way, but I also want to be authentic to what the Buddha taught. So if there was a historical Jesus, and I'm only saying that to not get into an argument about was there or wasn't there. If there was, well, look, there's a historical Jesus, and he taught a very specific religion, and he taught it in very specific ways. And he said, if you want to do this, act this way, and he gave directions. Someone who wants to be to learn about Islam, and that's their intention, should be dissuaded from looking at what Jesus taught, shouldn't they? It's just practical. If you want to learn about Islam, you can't learn it by following what Jesus taught. It doesn't invalidate Christianity. It's just two different things. And that's the important thing to recognize. That's where real wisdom and understanding comes from, recognizing things are different and they don't have to all be the same thing. So in talking about what the Buddha taught, even during his time when he was teaching, he pointed out the difference between what he teaches and what other people teach. You can call that rigid if you're concerned about not having things be one big pot of soup. But when you want to understand something specifically, you have to understand this is what it is. This is what this gentleman taught. And this is what it delivers. The Buddha taught, I teach understanding suffering and the cessation of suffering, nothing more. So that's all he was concerned about. He wasn't concerned about ending all other religions or philosophies during his time. His only concern was to present a true and authentic Dhamma that was useful to other people. And in that way, it's important to understand this is what the guy taught. And we're free to integrate it in any way we want. We can use it as part of a broad spiritual practice that incorporates everything out there. We're free to do that. Or we can use it in the way that the Buddha intended, which was use this path to developing understanding of suffering. Period. So, but it's such an important question, Debbie, and important on so many levels. In relation to the anatta and the Dhamma, it's a self-referential ego self that wants to homogenize everything into one neat view for myself, and everything fits the assumptions that I've made. Or we can learn to start seeing things discreetly and realize that the things that are no longer skillful or useful in my life, I can simply let go of. I don't have to reconcile them in any way. But does that help that?
Yeah, well, I think what helps is thinking of them different as opposed to right or wrong.
Yep.
And I think people go to war because this is the right way.
Yeah.
And if I can just think of it as different, it will help me.
Yeah.
Because that's true in relationship in so many ways in life.
Yep.
That there are differences, and we come to acceptance by recognizing differences. And stop trying to change people or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So that's helpful to put it in.
Yeah, I think the essence of intolerance is insisting that everything is the same and goes the same place. I think that's more responsible for the religious wars that we have than anything else. And I don't want to get into that, but it's more like that.
So anyway, in terms of my meditation and all of that, I feel like I'm working with right effort, and that I'm trying to start to integrate the second practice a little bit here and there when I can. And I'm trying to listen more and read more and, integrate into my life more. So that's good, but I feel like I'm so far from where Kevin is when he said what he went through and what how he was able to respond, because I still see myself as eye-making and reactive all too often. I mean, there are times when I'm realizing that I'm catching it, and backing off, but usually it's after that. And, so it's just an ongoing process, and I'm hopeful. When you said that one guy, it took him 45 years, the Buddha died, and maybe I was like, okay, I can still maybe get there. But I don't have 45 years, but maybe I still get there. So I'm holding on to that. So that's where I'm at.
Thank you, Ananda. But that was just him. You know, we'll awaken when we awaken.
Right.
And that's all you can do is to be mindful of right effort, even if it's after the fact that you're able to practice restraint. That's a profound change, rather than what we would normally do from conditioned mind is try to explain it away or avoid it or not learn from it. You know, blame everybody else for how we're thinking and how we're feeling. We learn from it. We practice restraint because you're integrating the Eightfold Path.
I'm able to apologize after. There's no vows. You know, like, once I get it, then I can say, well, I'm really sorry that I was trying to impose my view on you or whatever.
Yeah. And that actually makes a difference, rather than in a subtle way continuing an argument or not having any resolution.
Right.
And again, Debbie, that kind of points to maybe not a direct way, to what we just talked about what the Buddha taught is just different. And so when we start learning to see things in a discrete way rather than in a universal oneness kind of loop, which really doesn't make any sense. It doesn't do justice to life as life occurs. Things that occur, everything is discrete in its arising and passing away. That's the essence of impermanence. So we have especially those of us that were brought up Roman Catholic and then maybe Christian, we tend to want to conceptualize everything in a religious soup. In other words, there has to be some religious connotation to anything that might be so-called spiritual, like Buddhism. And so when someone says it's not this, it's that, it feels like a challenge on that Christianity, doesn't it? But it's just something different. So there was a religion that was started ostensibly by a man named Jesus Christ. Was that really his name? Didn't he have Jesus? Yes. And over time, a little bit less time than the Buddha's history, but Buddha was around 500 years earlier, 600 years earlier. There's a nearly infinite number of Christian religions too, that all kind of go back to Jesus Christ, but they're all different.
Not really.
But the point is that, and they are as different as Judaism, as Islamism, as paganism, as shamanism. Why do we have to insist that they're all basically the same underneath, just because we call them religions or belief systems? Leave them alone. Let them be what they are. And if they are useful for human society, they will continue. Maybe. And if not, they'll fall away. But we can decide what we want to think when we want to think it. And that's what the Buddha taught. And that's the difference between what the Buddha taught and religion. We're not teaching worship of anything. We're not teaching salvation. I mean, we meaning the Buddha, what we're doing here. We're simply teaching or learning another way of looking at the world based on reality. It's just something different. So, but it's such an important thing. So thank you for bringing it up and giving me the opportunity to talk about it. Lorna, good to see you.
Good to be here. I feel like we've talked about all of the Dhamma this morning. But getting back to the Four Foundations of Mindfulness, I'm beginning to realize that the way we meditate, we take ourselves off to a quiet spot in the house or whatever, quiet room, cushions, maybe darken the room and meditate. So that's sort of the ideal quietness and stillness that we can create to hold our mind or get our mind back onto our breath, so it will wander off again. I'm beginning to see that it's the mindfulness is really on a sliding scale. As we leave our cushions and we go into the outside world, we have more distractions. And it's the distractions that are seemingly making the mindfulness harder.
Yep.
In as much as if we're in our quiet spot in the home, on a quiet cushion, we can meditate
if we kind of stood in the middle of Times Square, it's going to be more difficult because there's just so much going on. There's so much more noise, smells. You know. So we really can approach it two ways. We can either not go to Times Square if we have the choice in life.
Yep.
It would be a skillful choice not to go to such an environment where you know you can't be mindful. That's one way you can do it. Or you can just up your game and realize that it's the distractions that are making your mindfulness so hard.
Mm. Were you finished? I didn't want my to interrupt you.
That is a, you know, and then I have something else to say, but you can comment on that.
Okay, don't forget what you have to say. There's a middle way there, though, that on our cushion, when the Buddha describes or describes how to meditate, he says, go find the root of a tree or an empty hut. Go find a secluded place to meditate. And that was the the most elaborate instruction the Buddha ever gave as far as environment for meditation. Now, it's much easier to meditate and when you're at the root of a tree or an empty hut in a quiet place, isn't it? It's difficult to take that well-concentrated mind and expect it to stay non-distracted in Times Square. In fact, I would say it's unrealistic. It's important. The Buddha and him lived separate from the world. And the main reason was so that they could deepen their concentration and have an environment that was conducive to developing the Dhamma. He recognized it was impossible to do that and just be in Times Square all the time. So the Times Square is a great metaphor for the First Noble Truth. Dukkha occurs, isn't it? And it's not because of the things that might happen at Times Square. Strange things used to happen much more in the past. It's because in a being in the middle of the world, it's impossible to develop the Dhamma. But so we can take refuge from the world in our meditation practice and hopefully in the way that we live our lives, that we're not constantly engaged in the world. One of the things that develops as Dhamma practice develops usually in most people is our lives themselves start to quiet down. We're not so engaged constantly in the outside world. Now, some of us have substituted Facebook or Twitter or the internet, etc., as a substitute for the outside world. So we're just as distracted. Even though we might be home, we're constantly looking at a screen somewhere. That's the same type of distraction. But to find the root of a tree or an empty hut in our ongoing life means to simplify our life and find a quieter way of living too. The Dhamma isn't. When I was a very young man and I started getting involved in spirituality, I was around 26 or 27, I likened myself to a spiritual warrior. In fact, there were books written about that. And that phrase is still often used. There's a modern Buddhist organization that talks about the spiritual warrior. When I started awakening, I didn't want to be a warrior anymore. I don't want to hold myself up against the dukkha of the world and prove that I can overcome it. That's not the Dhamma. The Dhamma is a way of developing a calm and peaceful mind no matter what's occurring, and that requires some withdrawal from the world to understand that I can't maintain a calm and peaceful mind if I'm constantly engaged in the world and thinking that I should, that this is some way using the Dhamma as a way to become a spiritual warrior and overcome the world denies the whole Dhamma, doesn't it? That's eye-making. To think that I should be more powerful than the middle way. Dukkha occurs. If I want to maintain a calm and peaceful mind, if I want to maintain a loving and compassionate mind, I need to practice restraint and withdraw from the world to a certain extent. to not feel like I always had to be on Times Square. It's a self-referential ego self that says I need to be always involved. I always need to be in Times Square. I need to be at ground zero because the whole world is revolving around me. And what happens if I'm not there? I might miss something. Or to take that realistic mind. The Buddha often talked about protecting our minds in a way. And we do that by developing concentration and then know through the framework of the Eightfold Path what I should think about and what I should hold in mind. And again, you described that beautifully. Lorna had another question or a comment.
Our problem of thinking we are this person, whatever it is, avatar. It's hard to we don't all know what our personal things are, but we've kind of areas that we'd like to improve on or recognize about ourselves, but we find it difficult to change because we think it's who we are.
Yeah.
We do that. So to look at the same thing another way is if you don't do what your usual habit is, just assess how disrupted your mind would be if you didn't do it. And when you really look at it, sometimes it's not a big thing. It's not going to be distressed if you don't do it. For instance, if you look at how disorientated or your mind would be if you sit in a chair and you're not watching a screen, it's actually not that difficult.
It shouldn't be.
You can assess that your mind is not going to be too disruptive by not watching a screen.
Yeah.
You can already assess that. And actually when you look at it, you can assess that you're not going to be too unhappy or about it. So looking at that is easier than trying not to watch the screen, because you're actually looking at your own self.
Yeah.
And your own familiar habits.
Yep.
So you could look at it that way, like watching a screen, or you could say, well, how much more destructive to my mind will it be if I drive a little bit slower? Well, actually, it's not going to be that destructive to my mind if I drive a little bit slower. But if I, you get that ego thing with the driving. But to pull back from the ego and the driving is harder than just to drive, just to assess how much you got it. You know what I mean? It's looking at the same thing differently.
Yeah.
And
Not looking at the ego, but looking at the other side and just thinking, well, that's not so bad either.
the framework for seeing the other side is the Eightfold Path. For seeing the alternative to I-making in that moment. It's very profound to be able to see that and understand at that level is where we're establishing or attempting to establish a self or attempting to establish awakening. It's at that point. Thank you. Jen, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, I just I heard what I was hearing from what you were saying, and might just be what's coming up for me. But in terms of wanting to maintain a calm and peaceful mind, I think not going into Times Square is an option, and going into Times Square with intention or right effort is also an option.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But there was sort of an underlying thing in the conversation that you guys were having that was making me, I wanted to point out that it was like, what is your intention? If your intention is to I want to maintain a calm and peaceful mind. There might be some clinging in there. And having
When you get into
so,
motivations,
yeah, I'm explaining.
no, but it's also an important question because it does come up. You know, is wanting to be awakened eye making?
Yeah.
It's taken in the right context, and certainly initially, I first started to meditate because I liked the idea that I could bilocate. That's what I mean. I thought I was into Eastern mysticism, and I studied some of this thing. I watched. There was a movie I saw as a kid that had people living 200 years. Can't think of the name of it right now. And I read books, from when I was young. I don't know if you heard of Yogananda, Paramahansa Yogananda. He wrote some great books that based on Hinduism and Kriya Yoga about having these incredible mental abilities where you could. I thought that was great. It was all eye making, and it didn't teach me anything about how to live in the world. Again, I'm not getting back to Debbie's, I'm not putting it down. It's something completely different. What made the most difference in my life was to recognize the distraction and the destructiveness of maintaining my ego self. Every problem I've ever had that I could do anything about was rooted in ignorance. Every single one. And so the solution for ongoing peace and happiness in my life was to recognize and abandon ignorance that would result in behavior that was hurtful towards me and others. And again, that's what the Buddha recognized. And it's just that simple. So in that way, it's not something against anything else. It's just different. Thank you for bringing that up, making that point. Scott, good to see you.
I'll be very brief.
No rush.
I'm meditating 10 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes in the evening.
Oh, this was 10:30.
It's great, and it's getting like this half-hour meditation went by very, very quickly. It's really helpful. Anyway, I had a setback at work about 2 weeks ago, and I was suffering because of it, and I decided to just accept it. And because I accepted it, everything changed, and my situation in life became I stopped suffering as much, and it's made my life so much better. This setback that I thought I was going to be suffering from. Before the setback happened, I decided to accept it. And then when it actually occurred and nothing horrible happened, it was actually better for my life. It just has made my life so amazing. It made me open to so many different things.
Yeah.
Such as coming to meditation class and things like that.
Yeah.
And studying through book as well. So that's just let the idea of acceptance seem to be really important before, instead of suffering with the pain of what might be, I decided to accept it, and it changed everything.
Thank you so much isn't that remarkable though? That radical acceptance, not needing to approve, just simply accepting it changes everything. That's an aspect of a well-concentrated mind with the refined mindfulness necessary to see things clearly. So thank you. I forgot that Matt is teaching Qigong, so I apologize for that. We're going to end quickly. We're not going to do metta today. We can live without it. This week we're going to be studying the next chapter on the Four Noble Truths, and I'll give a talk on that next week, and we'll discuss it. So thank you all for a wonderful class. Peace.
Pushing the pillows away.
Yes, please.